The military convoy rolled through the dusty roads of the remote village, its heavy tires kicking up clouds of sand that hung in the air like a brown curtain. Inside the third vehicle sat Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old combat medic with the United States Army. Her green eyes scanned the landscape through the reinforced windows, alert for any signs of danger. She had been deployed for 6 months now, and every day brought new challenges that tested not just her medical skills but her courage. Sarah came from a small town in Oregon where everyone knew everyone. She grew up helping her father in his veterinary clinic, learning early on how to stay calm when dealing with emergencies. Her mother had been a nurse, and together, her parents had instilled in her a deep sense of duty to help others. When Sarah enlisted in the Army at 22, her parents were worried but proud. They knew their daughter had a gift for healing and a heart brave enough to use it in the most dangerous places. The convoy was returning from a medical outreach mission in a nearby village. Sarah and her team had spent the day treating local children for various ailments, distributing medicine, and teaching basic hygiene practices. These missions were her favorite part of deployment. She loved seeing the smiles on the children's faces when they received care, the gratitude in the eyes of the mothers who had walked miles to bring their sick babies to the temporary clinic. Beside Sarah sat Corporal James Rodriguez, a young soldier from Texas who had become like a brother to her. He was always cracking jokes, trying to keep everyone's spirits up despite the constant tension they lived under. On her other side was Lieutenant Marksman, their unit commander, a serious man in his mid-30s who carried the weight of every soldier's safety on his shoulders. The radio crackled with routine check-ins from the lead vehicle. Everything seemed normal. Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly, her hand resting on her medical bag as she thought about the letter she would write to her parents that evening. She wanted to tell them about the little girl she had treated today, a 7-year-old with a badly infected wound on her leg. The child had been so brave, not crying once during the painful cleaning and bandaging. Sarah had given her a small teddy bear from her personal supplies, and the girl's face had lit up like the sun. Suddenly, the world exploded. The blast was deafening, a thunderous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The vehicle lurched violently to the side, and Sarah felt herself being thrown against the interior wall. Metal screamed and twisted. Glass shattered. The smell of burning fuel and smoke filled her nose and lungs. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out every other sound. When the vehicle finally stopped moving, Sarah found herself on the floor, tangled with equipment and other bodies. Pain shot through her left shoulder and her head throbbed. She tried to move, but something heavy was pinning her legs. Panic started to rise in her chest, but her training kicked in. She took a deep breath, trying to assess the situation despite the chaos. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear muffled shouting. Someone was pulling at her, trying to free her from the wreckage. She looked up and saw Lieutenant Chen's face, his mouth moving but no words reaching her. His forehead was bleeding, a steady stream of red running down the side of his face. Sarah tried to speak, to tell him she was okay, to ask about the others, but no sound came out. She tried again. Nothing. Her throat moved. Her mouth formed the words, but there was only silence. A cold fear gripped her heart. She couldn't speak. The blast had stolen her voice. Strong hands pulled her free from the wreckage. The bright sunlight made her squint as they dragged her clear of the smoking vehicle. Sarah could see now that they had been hit by a roadside bomb. The lead vehicle was on fire, black smoke billowing into the clear blue sky. Soldiers were running in all directions, some taking defensive positions, others rushing to help the wounded. Sarah's medical training overrode her fear. Even though she couldn't speak, even though her shoulder screamed with pain and her head felt like it might split open, she was a medic. People needed help. She pushed away the soldier trying to make her sit down and grabbed her medical bag, which someone had thrown clear of the vehicle. She stumbled toward the lead vehicle where she could see several soldiers lying on the ground. Her legs were shaky and the world seemed to tilt and spin, but she kept moving. The first soldier she reached was young, maybe 19, with a piece of shrapnel embedded in his thigh. He was screaming, his face twisted in agony. Sarah knelt beside him and opened her bag with trembling hands. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him he would be okay, to use her voice to calm him the way she had been trained. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. The soldier stared at her with wild, frightened eyes, not understanding why the medic wasn't talking to him. Fighting back tears of frustration, Sarah did the only thing she could. She placed her hand firmly on his chest, making eye contact, and nodded slowly. Then she pointed to his wound and began to work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the fabric of his uniform, assessing the injury, preparing to remove the shrapnel and stop the bleeding. As she worked in silence, other soldiers began to notice something was wrong with their medic. She wasn't giving orders, wasn't calling for supplies, wasn't doing any of the things they had seen her do in previous emergencies, but her hands never stopped moving and her eyes remained focused and determined. Corporal Rodriguez appeared at her side, his own arm bleeding from a deep gash. He looked at Sarah, saw her trying to speak with no sound coming out, and his face went pale. He understood immediately what had happened. The blast had taken her voice, but it hadn't taken her courage or her skills. Sarah finished stabilizing the first soldier and moved to the next, and then the next. She worked methodically through the wounded, her hands speaking the words her voice could not. With each soldier she treated, she developed a system of gestures and nods, pointing and demonstrating what she needed others to do to help her. The other soldiers began to understand and adapt, becoming her voice, following her silent instructions without question. They had trained with Sarah for months. They knew her competence, her dedication. They trusted her completely, even in this terrifying silence. As the dust began to settle and the immediate crisis passed, Sarah finally allowed herself to stop. She sat back on her heels, her uniform covered in blood, her hands shaking. She had saved lives today despite losing her voice. But as she looked around at the destruction, at the wounded soldiers being prepared for evacuation, she wondered if she would ever speak again. And if she couldn't, how could she continue to be the medic her unit needed? Lieutenant Chen approached her, a medic from another vehicle beside him. They needed to evacuate her for treatment, to get her to a field hospital where doctors could assess her injuries. Sarah shook her head firmly. She pointed to the other wounded soldiers, indicating they should go first. Chen started to argue, but Sarah's eyes were fierce and uncompromising. She would take care of everyone else first. That was who she was. That was what a medic did. Even without a voice, she would not abandon her duty or her brothers and sisters in arms. The real challenge was only beginning. The field hospital was a controlled chaos of activity when Sarah arrived 3 hours after the attack. Medical personnel moved efficiently between beds, their voices creating a constant hum of professional urgency. The smell of antiseptic mixed with dust and sweat hung heavy in the air. Sarah sat on a gurney in the corner, waiting her turn while doctors and nurses treated the more seriously wounded soldiers from her convoy. Her shoulder had been quickly bandaged by another medic during the helicopter ride, but it still throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. The cut on her head had stopped bleeding, leaving dried blood crusted in her hair. But these physical wounds were not what consumed her thoughts. Every few minutes she would test her voice, opening her mouth and pushing air from her lungs, hoping that this time sound would emerge. Every time she was met with the same terrifying silence. A doctor finally approached her, a woman in her 40s with kind brown eyes and gray streaks in her dark hair. Captain Rebecca Walsh had seen countless injuries during her 20 years of military service, but something about this silent medic, sitting so still on the gurney, touched her deeply. She had heard the stories from the other soldiers about how Sarah had treated the wounded without being able to speak, how she had refused evacuation until everyone else had been cared for. Dr. Walsh began her examination gently, checking Sarah's pupils with a small flashlight, probing carefully around the head wound. Sarah submitted to the examination without resistance, but her eyes never left the doctor's face, searching for answers. When Dr. Walsh tried to examine her throat, asking her to open her mouth and say, "Ah," Sarah complied with the first part, but no sound followed. The doctor made notes on her clipboard, her expression thoughtful but not alarmed. She wrote something down and showed it to Sarah. "The blast likely caused trauma to your vocal cords or the surrounding structures. We need to do some tests. Can you write?" Sarah nodded and accepted the notepad and pen the doctor offered. Her hand trembled as she wrote her first word since the explosion. "Will I speak again?" The handwriting was shaky but legible. Dr. Walsh read the question and placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's uninjured shoulder. She spoke slowly and clearly so Sarah could read her lips. "Many blast victims experience temporary voice loss. Your vocal cords may be swollen or bruised. We need to rule out more serious damage, but there is reason to be hopeful." The word temporary gave Sarah a glimmer of hope, but the word may filled her with dread. She wrote again. How long? Dr. Walsh's expression became more guarded. It varies. Days, weeks, sometimes months. In rare cases, the damage can be permanent. But let's not jump to conclusions. We'll get you to a specialist as soon as we can arrange transport. Sarah's heart sank. Months without speaking? Or worse, never speaking again? She thought about her role as a medic, how crucial communication was in emergency situations. How could she effectively lead a medical response if she couldn't give orders? Couldn't reassure the wounded? Couldn't call for the supplies she needed? The questions swirled in her mind like a storm. Over the next 2 days, Sarah underwent a series of tests. Doctors examined her throat with scopes, took x-rays and CT scans, and consulted with specialists via video link. The results were both encouraging and frustrating. There was no permanent structural damage to her vocal cords, no severed nerves or crushed cartilage. The working theory was that the blast had caused severe trauma and swelling that was affecting her ability to produce sound, possibly combined with a psychological component. One specialist suggested that sometimes after traumatic events, the mind creates protective barriers. Perhaps her voice was locked away, a subconscious response to the terror of the explosion. But whether the cause was purely physical, purely psychological, or a combination of both, the treatment was the same: time, rest, and therapy. Sarah was given a small whiteboard and markers to carry with her. She hated it. Every time she had to write something instead of just saying it, she felt the loss all over again. But she forced herself to adapt. She had always been a problem solver, someone who found ways around obstacles. This would be no different, she told herself, even if she didn't quite believe it. Her unit visited her in the hospital. Corporal Rodriguez came first, his arm in a sling but his smile as wide as ever. He tried to joke with her to lift her spirits, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. He kept talking, filling the silence that she could not, telling her about the other soldiers who had been wounded, assuring her that everyone was asking about her. Lieutenant Chen came later, his forehead stitched but otherwise unharmed. He sat beside her bed, his usual stern demeanor softened by genuine concern. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. Instead, he told her that she had saved 5 lives that day, with her quick action and expert care. He told her that the commanding officer was recommending her for a commendation for her bravery under fire. Sarah wrote on her whiteboard, "Just doing my job." Chen shook his head. "You did more than your job, Mitchell. You did it without a voice, in pain and shock. That's courage beyond measure." His words made her eyes burn with unshed tears, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. Crying felt like giving up, and she wasn't ready to do that. On the 3rd day, Sarah was transferred to a larger military hospital in Germany. The flight was long and uncomfortable, and she spent most of it staring out the window at the clouds below, wondering what her future held. Would she be discharged from the army? Sent home to Oregon to recuperate? The thought of leaving her unit, of not being able to serve as a medic anymore, was almost unbearable. At the hospital in Germany, she was assigned to a speech therapist named Hannah Schneider, a civilian contractor who worked with wounded soldiers. Hannah was young, probably close to Sarah's age, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and an energy that seemed at odds with the somber environment of the military hospital. Their first session was awkward. Hannah explained various techniques for vocal rehabilitation, exercises Sarah could do to strengthen the muscles in her throat and vocal cords. Sarah followed the instructions carefully, breathing in patterns, trying to make sounds that wouldn't come. After 45 minutes of frustrating failure, Sarah threw down her whiteboard in anger. Hannah didn't react with sympathy or platitudes. Instead, she looked Sarah straight in the eye and said something Sarah wasn't expecting. "You're angry, good, use that. Anger means you haven't given up. But I need you to understand something. Your voice isn't lost in your throat. It's lost in your head. Until you can get past the fear and the trauma of what happened, your body won't let you speak. The physical healing is happening, but the mental healing hasn't even started." Sarah grabbed her whiteboard and wrote furiously, "I'm not afraid. I just can't speak." Hannah read the words and smiled sadly. "Every soldier I've worked with who lost their voice in combat says the same thing. And they're all lying to themselves. Something in that moment of the explosion broke something inside you. Your voice is protecting you from having to fully process what happened. When you're ready to face it, your voice will come back." The words hit Sarah harder than she wanted to admit. Was Hannah right? Was she afraid? She thought back to the moment of the explosion, to the terror and chaos and pain. She had pushed it all down, focused on her training, on helping others. She hadn't let herself think about how close she had come to dying, how many of her friends had been hurt, how everything had changed in one violent instant. That night, alone in her hospital room, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding back. The fear, the grief, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss. She cried silently into her pillow, her shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound. She grieved for her voice, for the person she had been before the explosion, for the uncertain future that stretched before her. But even in the midst of her despair, a small spark of determination remained. She was a fighter. She had always been a fighter. She would find a way through this darkness, even if she had to do it in silence. She would prove to everyone and to herself that she was still the same strong, capable medic she had always been, voice or no voice. The next morning, Sarah woke with a new resolve. She would do whatever it took to heal, both physically and mentally. She would face her fears instead of running from them. And somehow, some way, she would find her voice again. Weeks passed in a blur of therapy sessions, medical examinations, and long hours alone with her thoughts. Sarah threw herself into the rehabilitation process with the same intensity she had brought to her combat medical training. Every morning she woke at 5, did her vocal exercises in front of the bathroom mirror, and tried not to feel defeated when no sound emerged from her throat. Hannah, the speech therapist, became more than just a medical professional to Sarah. She became a friend, someone who understood the unique challenges of recovering from trauma. During their sessions, Hannah would share stories of other soldiers she had worked with, people who had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Some had regained their voices after months of work. Others had found new ways to communicate, new purposes that didn't require speaking. One afternoon, Hannah brought something different to their session. Instead of the usual exercises and techniques, she handed Sarah a journal with a leather cover and thick, cream-colored pages. "I want you to start writing," Hannah said. "Not just notes on your whiteboard. Real writing. About what happened, about how you feel, about your fears and hopes. Sometimes we need to find our voice on paper before we can find it in our throats." Sarah took the journal hesitantly. She had never been much of a writer, had always preferred action to reflection. But she was willing to try anything. That evening, she sat cross-legged on her hospital bed and opened the journal to the first blank page. She stared at it for a long time before finally putting pen to paper. The words came slowly at first, then faster. She wrote about the explosion, describing details she hadn't let herself think about since that day, the smell of burning fuel, the taste of blood and dust in her mouth, the weight of responsibility as she moved from one wounded soldier to another. She wrote about her fear that she would never be a medic again, that her career and identity were over. She wrote about her parents back home in Oregon, how she dreaded the video calls with them because she could see the worry in their eyes every time she had to write her responses on her whiteboard. Night after night, Sarah filled the pages. Sometimes she wrote about her childhood, about the first time she helped her father save a sick dog, about her mother teaching her to stay calm in emergencies. Sometimes she wrote about her fellow soldiers, the bonds they had formed, the lives they had saved together. And sometimes she wrote about her anger at her own body for betraying her, for refusing to do something as simple and essential as making sound. During this time, Sarah also began working in the hospital's physical therapy ward. She couldn't treat patients as a medic without being able to communicate effectively, but she could help in other ways. She assisted the physical therapists, learning sign language to communicate with them and the patients. She discovered that many of the wounded soldiers appreciated her silent presence. They didn't need her to talk. They needed her to listen, to understand, to be there with them in their pain and struggle. One patient in particular caught Sarah's attention. His name was Private Daniel Hayes, a 21-year-old from Alabama who had lost both legs below the knee in an IED explosion. Daniel was angry, bitter, and convinced his life was over. He refused to cooperate with his physical therapists, refused to try the prosthetic limbs, refused to do anything but lie in his bed staring at the ceiling. Sarah started visiting Daniel every day. At first he ignored her, turning his face to the wall when she entered his room. But Sarah was persistent. She would sit beside his bed with her journal and write. sometimes showing him what she had written. She wrote about her own struggles, her own fears and frustrations. She wrote about how hard it was to lose something you had taken for granted, how the future could seem dark and empty when you couldn't see past the loss. Slowly, Daniel began to respond. He started reading what Sarah wrote, and eventually he began to talk to her. He told her about his dreams of becoming a mechanic, about his girlfriend back home who had stopped answering his calls, about his fear that no one would ever see him as anything but a disabled veteran. Sarah listened, her eyes never leaving his face, her presence a silent affirmation that he was heard, that he mattered. One day, Daniel asked her a question that stopped her cold. "Why are you doing this? You can't even talk to me. Why do you care?" Sarah picked up her whiteboard and wrote, "Because someone needs to show you that losing a part of yourself doesn't mean losing everything. We're both fighting to get back what we lost. Maybe we can help each other win that fight." Daniel read her words, and for the first time since Sarah had met him, she saw tears in his eyes. The next day, he agreed to try the prosthetic legs. Sarah was there, writing encouragement on her whiteboard, celebrating each small victory as Daniel took his first painful steps. Watching him fight his way back to mobility gave Sarah hope for her own recovery. If he could learn to walk again, surely she could learn to speak again. Meanwhile, Sarah's case had attracted attention from some of the top medical specialists in the military. They were fascinated by her condition, by the fact that there was no physical reason for her continued muteness. One doctor suggested hypnotherapy, another recommended medication for anxiety and trauma. A third wanted to try experimental treatments involving electrical stimulation of the vocal cords. Sarah agreed to try everything. She sat through hypnotherapy sessions where a doctor with a soothing voice tried to guide her back to the moment before the explosion, to help her process the trauma. She took medications that made her drowsy and disconnected. She endured treatments that sent strange tingling sensations through her throat and jaw. Nothing worked. Her voice remained locked away beyond her reach. The medical board began discussing her future. 6 weeks had passed since the explosion. The consensus was that she should be medically discharged from active duty, sent back to the United States for long-term treatment and rehabilitation. Sarah knew this was coming, but the news still hit her like a physical blow. The Army had been her home, her purpose, her identity. Who was she without it? Lieutenant Chen came to visit her the day before she was scheduled to leave Germany. He brought news from the unit. They had returned to active duty, continuing the mission without her. Corporal Rodriguez had been promoted. 2 new medics had joined the team. Life had moved on. Sarah listened to his updates, feeling like she was hearing about a life that had belonged to someone else, some version of herself that no longer existed. Before Chen left, he handed her an envelope. "The unit wanted you to have this," he said. Inside was a certificate, unofficial but meaningful. It declared Sarah Mitchell an honorary lifetime member of the unit, with a note signed by every soldier. "Your voice may be silent," the note read, "but your actions speak louder than words ever could. You are a hero and you will always be one of us." Sarah clutched the certificate to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to thank Chen, to tell him how much this meant to her, to express the tangle of emotions choking her heart. But all she could do was nod and mouth the words "thank you," hoping he understood. That night, Sarah lay awake in her hospital bed, thinking about her future. Tomorrow she would fly to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland, where she would continue her treatment and rehabilitation. Eventually, she would be sent home to Oregon, back to the small town where everyone would know that she had returned broken, unable to do the job she had trained so hard to do. She picked up her journal and began to write in the darkness, her pen moving across the page by the light of the moon through her window. She wrote about her fear of going home, of facing her parents and old friends, of being defined by what she had lost rather than what she still had. She wrote about Daniel and the other patients she had worked with, about how helping them had given her a sense of purpose even in her silence. She wrote about the moment of the explosion, facing it fully for the first time, letting herself remember every terrifying detail. As she wrote, something shifted inside her, a tightness in her chest that had been there since the explosion began to ease. The weight of unspoken words and unfaced fears began to lift just a little. She still couldn't speak, but for the first time she felt like maybe that was okay. Maybe her voice would return, or maybe it wouldn't. Either way, she was still Sarah Mitchell. She was still a healer. She still had something to offer the world, She closed the journal and finally allowed herself to sleep, unaware that the next chapter of her journey would bring both new challenges and unexpected discoveries about the true meaning of communication and courage. Walter Reed Medical Center was unlike any hospital Sarah had experienced. The sprawling facility in Maryland housed some of the most severely wounded service members from conflicts around the world. Everywhere she looked, she saw young men and women dealing with injuries that would have been fatal in previous wars. Missing limbs, traumatic brain injuries, severe burns, and psychological wounds that couldn't be seen but were just as devastating. Sarah arrived on a gray October morning, the leaves on the trees turning brilliant shades of red and gold. She was assigned to a room in the neurological wing, where patients with various nerve damage and brain injuries received treatment. Her new doctor was Colonel Martin Foster, a neurologist who had spent 30 years treating combat veterans. He had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and a no-nonsense approach that Sarah immediately respected. After reviewing her files and conducting his own examination, Colonel Foster sat down across from Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "I've seen a lot of cases like yours," he said. "The body and mind are connected in ways we still don't fully understand. Sometimes, when we experience severe trauma, our brain decides to protect us by shutting down certain functions. Your vocal cords are physically capable of producing sound. The question is whether your mind will allow them to." Sarah wrote on her whiteboard, "How do I convince my mind?" Colonel Foster smiled. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Sometimes it happens spontaneously. Sometimes it requires intensive therapy. Sometimes it never happens at all, and the person learns to build a new life around their limitation. What I want you to understand is that recovering your voice isn't the only path to healing. Healing means accepting where you are now and finding meaning in it." The words frustrated Sarah. She didn't want to accept her silence. She wanted to fight it, to overcome it, to go back to being the person she was before the explosion. But a small part of her, the part that had been growing through her journal writing and her work with patients like Daniel, wondered if the colonel might be right. Maybe acceptance wasn't the same as giving up. Maybe it was the first step toward something new. At Walter Reed, Sarah continued her speech therapy with a new therapist named Marcus Thompson. Marcus was a veteran himself, having lost his hearing in one ear during his service. He understood the unique challenges of military medical discharge, the sense of identity lost when you could no longer serve. He pushed Sarah harder than Hannah had, refusing to let her sink into self-pity or resignation. Marcus introduced Sarah to a support group for veterans with communication disorders. The group met every Wednesday evening in a small conference room. There were soldiers who stuttered, some who had lost their hearing, one who had suffered a stroke that affected his speech, and several others like Sarah, who had lost their voices to trauma. At first, Sarah resisted joining. She didn't want to sit around talking about feelings and limitations, but Marcus insisted, and Sarah had learned to trust his judgment. The first meeting was eye-opening. Sarah listened as each person shared their story, their struggles, and their small victories. A former sergeant named Patrick talked about learning to accept his stutter instead of fighting it, about how that acceptance had actually made his speech more fluid. A young corporal named Lisa, who had lost her hearing in one ear, talked about becoming an advocate for disabled veterans, finding a voice through activism even though she struggled to hear. When it was Sarah's turn to share, she held up her whiteboard. "I was a combat medic. I saved lives. Now I can't even tell someone I need help. I don't know who I am without my voice." The group sat in understanding silence. Then Patrick spoke. "You're still a medic. You're still a healer. The method might be different, but the heart is the same. That doesn't change because you lost your voice. That's who you are, deeper than words." His words struck something deep within Sarah. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she hadn't fully appreciated what remained. Her knowledge, her training, her compassion, her ability to stay calm in emergencies, none of that had been taken by the explosion. Only the sound of her voice was missing. Everything else was still there, still hers, still valuable. That realization marked a turning point. Sarah began to see her situation differently. Instead of viewing her silence as a disability that prevented her from being a medic, she started exploring how she could use her medical skills in new ways. She researched careers in medical research, medical writing, and medical education. She discovered a whole world of ways to heal and help that didn't require speaking. One afternoon, while wandering the hospital grounds, Sarah encountered a young girl visiting her father, a soldier recovering from a severe leg injury. The girl, maybe 6 years old, was crying inconsolably. Her mother was trying to calm her, but the child was too upset. Sarah approached them instinctively, the way she always responded to someone in distress. She knelt down to the girl's level and made eye contact. The child looked at her with tear-filled eyes. Sarah smiled gently and pulled out her whiteboard, drawing a simple smiley face. The girl sniffled, watching. Sarah drew another face, this one with tears like the girl was crying. Then she drew the same face with the tears turning into a smile. The girl watched, fascinated despite her upset. Sarah pointed to the sad face, then to the girl, then to the smiling face. She reached out and gently touched the girl's hand, her eyes conveying warmth and understanding. The girl's crying slowed. Sarah drew more pictures, a dog, a cat, a flower. The girl started to giggle. Within 5 minutes, the crisis was over. The mother looked at Sarah with gratitude and surprise. "Thank you so much," the mother said. "I don't know how you did that." "Are you a therapist?" Sarah shook her head and wrote on her whiteboard. "Just someone who understands that sometimes you don't need words to help." The mother read the note and smiled. "That's a gift. A real gift." The encounter stayed with Sarah long after the mother and daughter had gone. She had helped without speaking, had connected with a child in distress using only gestures, drawings, and presence. Maybe there was more than one way to be a healer. Maybe her voice, when and if it returned, wouldn't be the only tool she needed. Around this time, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the physician who had first treated her at the field hospital, had come to Walter Reed for a conference. She had specifically asked to see Sarah. They met in the hospital cafeteria over coffee. Sarah with her ever-present whiteboard. Dr. Walsh wanted to know how Sarah was doing, not just medically but emotionally. Sarah wrote honestly about her struggles, her small victories, her uncertainty about the future. Dr. Walsh listened carefully, then shared something that surprised Sarah. "I've been following your case," she said. "Not just out of medical interest, but because I think you represent something important. In modern medicine, we've become so focused on fixing problems, on restoring people to exactly how they were before, that we sometimes miss other possibilities." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Sarah, I'm involved in developing a new program for wounded veterans. It's focused on adaptive medical training, teaching soldiers with various disabilities how to continue serving in medical roles in modified capacities. We need people who understand both the medical side and the disability side. I think you could be instrumental in developing this program. Not as a patient, but as a designer and eventually an instructor." Sarah stared at Dr. Walsh, her mind racing. The idea had never occurred to her that her experience, her silence, could be valuable, rather than disqualifying. She wrote quickly, "But I can't speak." "How can I teach?" Dr. Walsh smiled. "You're already teaching, Sarah. Every time you help another patient, every time you adapt and find a new way to communicate, you're teaching. We have video equipment. We have sign language interpreters. We have text-to-speech technology. Your voice is only one method of communication. Your knowledge and experience are what matter most." That evening, Sarah sat in her room thinking about Dr. Walsh's proposal. It was tempting, exciting even, but it also scared her. Accepting this role would mean accepting her silence as potentially permanent, building a future around it rather than waiting for it to end. Was she ready for that? Could she truly let go of the hope that one day she would wake up and her voice would be back, and everything would return to normal? She opened her journal and began to write, working through her conflicting emotions on paper. She wrote about her fear of giving up on her voice, but also about her growing understanding that moving forward didn't mean giving up. She could pursue this new opportunity while still hoping for recovery. The two weren't mutually exclusive. By the time she finished writing, the moon was high in the sky outside her window. Sarah felt clearer than she had in weeks. She would accept Dr. Walsh's offer. She would help develop this program, would use her experience to help other wounded veterans find new ways to serve and heal. And if her voice came back, wonderful. If it didn't, she would have built a meaningful life anyway. Sarah closed her journal and prepared for bed, feeling something she hadn't felt since before the explosion. Hope for the future. Not the future she had planned, but a future that held meaning and purpose nonetheless. The next 3 months transformed Sarah's life in ways she never expected. She dove into the work of developing the adaptive medical training program with Dr. Walsh and a team of specialists. The program aimed to help wounded veterans who still wanted to serve in medical capacities, despite their disabilities. It was groundbreaking work, combining traditional medical training with adaptive technologies and techniques. Sarah's role was unique. She served as both a consultant and a test subject, helping the team understand the challenges that disabled medics would face and developing solutions. She learned advanced sign language, became proficient with text-to-speech software, and experimented with various communication devices. She discovered that modern technology offered incredible tools for people who couldn't speak, from apps that converted typed text to spoken words to devices that could be controlled with eye movements. But more importantly, Sarah discovered that her silence had given her unexpected insights. She had learned to read people in ways she never had before. Without the ability to speak, she had become hyper-aware of body language, facial expressions, and subtle cues that others missed. She could sense when someone was in pain even when they tried to hide it, could tell when a patient needed comfort more than treatment. These skills made her an even better medical professional in some ways. The program began accepting its first students in January, exactly 7 months after Sarah's injury. 5 veterans with various disabilities enrolled. There was Marcus, a former Army nurse who had lost both hands in an explosion, but had been fitted with advanced prosthetics. There was Jennifer, a Navy corpsman who had suffered a traumatic brain injury that affected her short-term memory. There was Ramon, an Air Force medic who used a wheelchair after a spinal injury. There was Lisa from Sarah's support group, the corporal who had lost hearing in one ear. And there was David, a Marine who had severe PTSD that made it difficult for him to function in high-stress environments. Sarah worked with each of them, demonstrating techniques, sharing her experiences, and helping them adapt their skills to their new realities. She communicated through her whiteboard, her laptop with text-to-speech software, and sometimes just through demonstration and gesture. The students quickly learned that communication was about more than words. It was about connection, understanding, and the genuine desire to help others. One morning in late January, Sarah was conducting a training session on trauma response. The students were practicing triage techniques using medical simulation dummies when David suddenly froze. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his eyes wide with panic. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. He was having a PTSD episode, triggered by something in the exercise that reminded him of combat. The other students stepped back, unsure what to do. Sarah moved quickly but calmly to David's side. She didn't try to touch him, knowing that unexpected contact could make things worse. Instead, she positioned herself in his line of sight and made eye contact. She held up her hand, palm out, and began to breathe slowly and deeply, exaggerating the motion so he could see it clearly. David's eyes locked onto hers. Sarah continued the breathing pattern, slow and steady. In hold out hold. She kept her expression calm and reassuring. After several minutes, David's breathing began to slow, matching her rhythm. The panic in his eyes gradually faded, replaced by exhaustion and embarrassment. When he was stable, Sarah wrote on her whiteboard, "You're safe. You're here with us. The past can't hurt you now." David read the words and nodded, tears streaming down his face. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. The other students gathered around, offering their support without judgment. They all understood what David was going through. They had all faced their own demons. After that incident, something shifted in the group dynamic. They became more than just students in a program. They became a team, a family even. They supported each other through bad days, celebrated each other's victories, and learned together how to adapt and overcome. Sarah watched them grow and transform, and in watching them, she continued to transform herself. During this time, Sarah maintained her work with Marcus Thompson in speech therapy. They had shifted focus from trying to force her voice to return to exploring the psychological barriers that might be keeping it locked away. Marcus used various techniques, including trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR, to help Sarah process the explosion and its aftermath. In one particularly intense session, Marcus asked Sarah to close her eyes and visualize the moment before the explosion. She resisted at first, fear tightening her chest, but Marcus's calm voice guided her. She let herself remember. The dust on the road, the sound of the convoy's engines, the feeling of safety and purpose. Then the blast, the terror, the chaos. But this time, instead of pushing the memories away, Sarah sat with them. She let herself feel the fear, the pain, the overwhelming helplessness. And as she did, Marcus asked her a question. What did you want to say in that moment? What words were locked in your throat? Sarah's eyes snapped open. She grabbed her whiteboard with shaking hands and wrote, "Help." I wanted to scream for help. For them, for me. I wanted to tell them it would be okay. I wanted to call out orders. I wanted to cry out in pain. All of it, everything, and I couldn't. Marcus nodded slowly. Your voice was trying to do too much. It was overwhelmed. So it shut down. Sarah, you don't have to carry all of that anymore. You don't have to be the one with all the answers, the one who saves everyone, the one who never shows fear or pain. That's too much for one voice to carry. His words hit Sarah like a revelation. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the calm center in any storm. She had trained herself never to show weakness, never to let fear or doubt creep into her voice when she was treating the wounded. Her voice had carried so much weight, so much responsibility. Maybe it had simply become too heavy to bear. That night, Sarah wrote in her journal for hours. She wrote about the burden she had placed on herself, the impossible standard she had tried to maintain. She wrote about how her voice had become more than just a means of communication. It had become her identity, her worth, her proof that she was capable and strong. When the explosion took her voice, it had felt like losing herself, because she had tied so much of who she was to that one ability. But she was learning that she was more than her voice. She was more than any single ability or role. She was Sarah Mitchell, a healer, a teacher, a survivor, a friend. With or without sound, she was still herself, still valuable, still worthy. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in months. She went through her usual routine, starting with her vocal exercises. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, placing her hand on her throat, and tried to make sound. As always, nothing came. But this time the failure didn't crush her. She simply nodded to her reflection and moved on with her day. She was teaching a class later that morning on emergency response protocols when something unexpected happened. Jennifer, the student with memory issues, was demonstrating a technique incorrectly. She was getting frustrated, tears forming in her eyes, convinced she would never be able to retain the information she needed. Sarah moved to her side, intending to write correction on her whiteboard, but watching Jennifer's frustration, seeing her pain, Sarah felt a surge of emotion. Without thinking, without planning, Sarah opened her mouth. You can do this. The words were rough, scratchy, barely more than a whisper, but they were words. Sound. Voice. The room went completely silent. Every student stared at Sarah in shock. Sarah's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with disbelief.
Had she actually spoken?
Or had she imagined it? Jennifer was staring at her, mouth open. You talked. I heard you. The other students began to react, some laughing, some crying, all of them moving toward Sarah. Sarah tried again, forcing air through her vocal cords. I spoke. The words were clearer this time, though still rough and quiet. Her voice didn't sound like it had before. It was different, changed by months of silence and trauma. But it was there. It was real. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as the reality hit her. Her voice had come back. Not gradually, not through intensive therapy or medical intervention, but spontaneously, in a moment when she had stopped trying to force it and had simply responded from her heart to someone who needed encouragement. The students surrounded her, celebrating, but Sarah barely heard them. She was too busy testing her voice, saying simple words, listening to the sound of her own speech for the first time in 7 months. It was rough, weak, inconsistent. Some words came easily, others stuck in her throat, but it was progress. It was hope. It was a beginning. The return of Sarah's voice was not the miracle ending she had once imagined. It came back slowly, unpredictably, like a muscle that had atrophied and needed to be rebuilt. Some days she could speak in short sentences. Other days the words would stick in her throat again, and she would have to resort to her whiteboard. Her voice was different now, lower and rougher than before, marked by the trauma it had endured. Marcus Thompson explained that this was normal. The psychological barriers that had blocked her voice completely had weakened, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Sarah would need continued therapy to fully regain her vocal abilities. More importantly, she would need to relearn how to use her voice without the crushing weight of responsibility she had once placed on it. The news of Sarah's voice returning spread quickly, through Walter Reed. Dr. Walsh was thrilled but not surprised. She had seen similar breakthroughs before, moments when patients stopped fighting their limitations and found healing and acceptance. Colonel Foster congratulated Sarah but reminded her that recovery was not a straight line. There would be setbacks and challenges ahead. Sarah's students were the most affected by her voice's return. For them, she had been a symbol of strength in silence, proof that disability didn't mean inability. When she first spoke to them, some worried that this meant she would leave, that she no longer needed them or the program. Sarah quickly addressed these fears in a class the next day. "My voice came back," she said, her words slow and deliberate, still weak, but growing stronger. "But that doesn't change who I am now. I am not the same person I was before the explosion. I have learned things in silence that I never would have learned with my voice. I have gained skills and insights that make me a better healer, a better teacher, a better person. My voice is a tool, not my identity. And what I want you all to understand is that your disabilities are not your identities either. They are circumstances you navigate, challenges you adapt to, but they do not define your worth or your capability." The students listened intently, and Sarah could see the impact of her words on their faces. Jennifer wiped away tears. David sat straighter. Ramon nodded in understanding. These were people who had been told, directly or indirectly, that their injuries made them less valuable, less capable. Sarah was showing them a different truth. Over the following weeks, Sarah continued to work on her voice while maintaining her teaching responsibilities. She worked with Marcus 3 times a week, doing exercises to strengthen her vocal cords and practicing techniques to manage the anxiety that sometimes caused her voice to fail. She learned breathing exercises, meditation, and cognitive strategies for staying calm when speaking became difficult. But Sarah also made a conscious decision not to rely solely on her voice anymore. She continued using sign language, text-to-speech software, and her whiteboard. She had learned that communication was about so much more than speaking, and she wanted to maintain all the tools she had developed. Besides, being fluent in multiple forms of communication made her a better teacher for her students, who used various methods themselves. In March, Sarah received unexpected news. The military wanted to do a feature story about her and the adaptive medical training program. A journalist and photographer would visit Walter Reed to interview her and the students, and the story would be published in a military magazine and potentially picked up by civilian news outlets. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want attention or recognition. She just wanted to do her work. But Dr. Walsh convinced her that the story could help other wounded veterans see possibilities they might not have known existed. It could inspire change in how the military viewed and utilized soldiers with disabilities. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. The journalist, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who had covered military stories for years, arrived on a sunny afternoon in mid-March. She spent hours interviewing Sarah and the students, asking thoughtful questions about their experiences, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. Sarah spoke carefully, her voice still unpredictable, sometimes strong and sometimes failing mid-sentence. When words wouldn't come, she used her whiteboard, and Rebecca Chen documented everything. The photographer captured Sarah teaching a class, working one-on-one with students and sitting quietly in reflection. One photo in particular would later become iconic. Sarah standing before her students, one hand on her whiteboard, the other gesturing as she explained a medical procedure. Her expression was focused and passionate, and the students around her were completely engaged. The image captured everything the program represented: adaptation, determination, and the power of teaching and learning in new ways. During the interview, Rebecca asked Sarah a question that made her pause. "Do you consider yourself disabled?" Sarah had never really thought about it in those terms. She had been so focused on recovery, on getting back to who she was, that she hadn't stopped to consider how she identified now. After a long moment, Sarah answered slowly, "I am a person with a disability. My voice was taken from me by trauma, and even though it has partially returned, I will probably always have limitations with speech. But disabled is not a bad word to me. It is simply a description of my current reality. I am disabled and capable. I am disabled and strong. I am disabled and valuable. These things are not contradictions. They are all true at the same time." Rebecca wrote down every word, and Sarah could see that her answer had moved the journalist deeply. It was in that moment that Sarah realized how far she had come. 7 months ago, she would have rejected the label of disabled entirely, seeing it as a sign of weakness or failure. Now she understood that disability was just another aspect of human diversity, neither good nor bad in itself, simply a fact to be acknowledged and adapted to. The article was published in April and created a wave of response that surprised everyone. It was picked up by major news outlets, shared widely on social media, and sparked conversations about how the military treated wounded veterans. Sarah received letters from soldiers around the world, thanking her for her service and for showing them that their injuries didn't mean the end of their purpose. One letter in particular touched Sarah deeply. It was from Private Daniel Hayes, the young soldier who had lost both legs and whom Sarah had helped in Germany. Daniel wrote that he was now training to become a physical therapist, specializing in working with amputees. He credited Sarah with showing him that loss could be transformed into purpose, that his experience with disability made him uniquely qualified to help others facing similar challenges. Sarah kept Daniel's letter in her journal, reading it whenever she felt discouraged or uncertain. It reminded her why she was doing this work, why the pain and struggle had been worth it. She was creating ripples of change and hope that extended far beyond her own life. By May, Sarah's voice had stabilized considerably. She could speak for longer periods now, though her voice tired easily and sometimes failed when she was stressed or exhausted. She had accepted that this might be her permanent reality, a voice that worked most of the time but not all the time. She had adapted her life and work around this truth. The adaptive medical training program was expanding. More students were enrolling, and there was talk of creating similar programs at other military medical facilities. Sarah was being considered for a permanent position as a lead instructor and program developer. It was everything she hadn't known she wanted, a career that used her medical knowledge and her personal experience with disability to help others. In late May, Sarah received a surprise video call. It was from Lieutenant Chen and Corporal Rodriguez, calling from their deployment. The rest of the unit crowded into the frame, all of them wanting to see Sarah and tell her how proud they were. They had read the article, seen the photos, and heard about the program's success. "You're still saving lives, Mitchell," Lieutenant Chen said, his stern face breaking into a rare smile. "Just in a different way than before. We always knew you were the best medic we had. Now the whole world knows it too." Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, sir. I miss you all." Her voice was strong in that moment, clear and steady. She realized that speaking to her unit, her family, brought out the best in her voice because it came from a place of love and connection rather than fear or obligation. Rodriguez jumped in, grinning widely. "When we get back stateside, we're coming to visit. I want to see this program you've built. Maybe you can teach this old dog some new tricks." The other soldiers laughed and chimed in with their own comments and well wishes. Sarah soaked it all in, grateful for these people who had seen her at her worst and still believed in her at her best. After the call ended, Sarah sat quietly in her room, reflecting on her journey. From the moment of the explosion to now, she had traveled a path she never could have imagined. She had lost her voice and found it again, but more importantly, she had lost her old identity and discovered a new one that was richer and deeper than before. She opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write her final entry in this particular chapter of her life. She wrote about the power of acceptance, about how fighting reality often caused more suffering than the reality itself. She wrote about the unexpected gifts that came with loss, deeper empathy, greater creativity, stronger connections,